Hi everybody, I'm George Coors, and today let's talk about The Vegetarian by Han Kang. I think that this is a fairly timely novel, and a lot of folks are going to recognize it because last year Han Kang was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, so her works have become more widely read and more ubiquitously talked about. Also, The Vegetarian won the International Booker Prize in 2016. So her work has become very widely read. This is translated from the Korean into the English by Deborah Smith. And, Kang came across my radar about 10 years ago. I was interested in reading Greek Lessons, a separate novel by her that I have, and maybe I'll do a video on. I think her work has become more widely read with good reason. There's a lot going on in The Vegetarian. I've seen a good bit of discussion of The Vegetarian on socials, and I've seen some folks, frankly, put off by some of the varying aspects within this novel. I've also heard folks talking about the translation, other various things, but I think The Vegetarian is a very, very well done work from a writerly perspective. And I think also just from a narrative perspective, it's very compelling. Overall, I think, something like the Nobel, a prize like the Nobel, it carries a major cultural cachet with it. It's going to inspire a lot of curiosity about a writer's works and why they have been awarded this very fancy, important work. And, honestly, that's all pretty reasonable for us to do. Here are the notes I took. That's an easy process for us as readers to sort of be critical. Why are these particular folks awarding this particular individual this gigantic, huge thing? What accomplishment is it? And to my taste, in The Vegetarian, I think Kang is a very, very sharp writer, and we're going to discuss that today. Before we go any further, if you like my videos and you want to support me, please buy my novel, Always the Wanderer. You can buy it where you buy your books. Please support your local independent authors. Support me. If you have watched a bunch of my videos, you don't own this book yet, buy 2 copies, please. That is really important. That's one of the ways that you can support me. That's why I do these videos, support my own writing. So let's get back to Kang. This novel, it's relatively on the shorter side. It's less than 200 pages, and it comes in 3 parts. Part 1 is called The Vegetarian. Part 2 is called Mongolian Mark, and Part 3 is called Flaming Trees. And this is important because each of the 3 parts are narrated by a different person in the vegetarian's life. So the vegetarian is sort of the focus of the novel, although we may say that there might not be necessarily one distinct protagonist here, because the narration doesn't always come from the vegetarian. In fact, it very rarely comes from the vegetarian herself. It comes from people in her life who are commenting on her status, her wellness, her mental status, her physical status, and so on, her physical and mental health. Ultimately, this novel and what Kang is doing here is a very, very sharp meditation on a longer tradition of human violence. And that's probably going to spoil for some of you one of the book recommendations that I have later on in the video. But what I'm seeing here, and what I think is really well done from a thematic and almost philosophical standpoint, let's say definitely philosophical standpoint, is that Kang is engaging in a almost absurdist, and I think some people would call it magical realist, but I'm going to stick with absurdism here, an almost absurdist critique of the tradition of human violence and how violence is exercised in families and in small communities every single day. And that's part of this larger human condition of violence. And I think that is really compelling. And I think, to me, that was tip to tail in this novel. What kept me going and what really held tight to me as a reader as I was engaging in this work was just thinking about this long-standing tradition that every single character in this novel is dealing with, that all of us as humans are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Part 1 introduces that pretty well. The vegetarian has a dream. She gives up eating meat. And this spirals in a spectacular manner as her family just spins out of control, seemingly as a result of this vegetarianism. And obviously, this is allegorical and symbolic of a greater sort of rejection of human violence. And seeing the individual characters, how they respond to it, how they engage in their own acts of violence is really harrowing. And I think it's really, really fantastically done. One of the things that I would say, and I've done this a few times on the channel where, Game Respects Game, as a writer, I take my hat off to other writers. I had to take my hat off to Han Kang for very deliberately playing with the narration more and more as we get along through the narrative. That can be tough to do. Sometimes you get out of the gate strong and you're immediately messing with the reader and how things are arranged on the page and how the narration is and how reliable that narration is. It's pretty steady with Kang. We slowly get more and more experimentation within the text when it comes to messing around with tense, person, perspective, and I think that is really excellently done. And to that end, I think Deborah Smith, as a translator, did a pretty good job here. I think for me, of the three parts, part 3 probably sings the most. I'm going to talk about that later on in the video. But I think part 3 really stood out to me as a really strong, extremely compelling section of literature. And, I mentioned at the top of the video, we might ask ourselves as readers, as writers, why is one person being awarded this thing? And I think a cynic's response to that is probably corporate interest, and that is probably true. But there's also, an undeniable artistic merit that goes into something like the Nobel Prize, whether that's tied into this grander scheme or not. And I think here with Kang's work, you could see in part 3, Flaming Trees of the Vegetarian, you can see a writer at the top of her game and doing absolutely excellent stuff. So, I think if you're going to read this novel, I would really encourage you to stick it out through part 3. I know that may be asking a lot, because I would also say that I can see a lot of readers. I notice a lot of readers really off-put by challenging texts, and I don't mean textually challenging, but I mean texts that approach taboo topics. And Kang is doing that here. There is a lot of violence in this. There is a lot. It's grotesque. There is a lot of eroticism that is also grotesque. There's sexual violence. And that can be very off-putting for readers, especially when we live in times that are really, really charged. Like we do now. If you're living in South Korea, if you're living in the United States, if you're living in Germany, if you're living in Argentina, you're probably experiencing a major political upheaval. As we see various systems and governments engage in various kinds of nonsense, let's say. And I think, readers in the United States, I could see being put off by this because it is a really frank and forward condemnation and observation about the tradition of human violence. But part of that understanding human violence is observational. And Kang is doing that here in all 3 parts, I would say, as well. All 3 of these parts, not only do we see like physical and emotional violence, but we also see these almost akin to microaggressions, these little bits of just not niceness that are exchanged between people in a community. And it can be at times really harrowing. Now, is it the most brutal novel I've ever read? Maybe not, probably not. But I do think that, going into it, you need to have an understanding that you are going to be witness to this violence, that you're going to be witness to this human tradition. And that part of the question that Kang is leaving us is, what is your role? What is my role? What is Kang's role in this larger human tradition of violence? And I think it's very well done overall. I think parts 2 and part 3... in particular, as the narrative speeds up, philosophically speaking, I was really smitten with part 3 in particular, but part 2 as well. I think there's a lot going on in this novel, and that always pleases me to see a really, really tightly written, really short, really concise novel that has a lot going on is nice. I love a really long novel, and I think, maximalist novels, I use that term loosely, but longer novels that are allowed to live more than shorter novels can be really, really excellent. If we have to constrain ourselves to a very short format, which is this sort of, in my mind, post-Hemingway obsession with being concise, which has become very corporate to my mind as well, then Kang is doing it right. Kang is doing it right by packing in such sharp reflection on pretty much every page of the work. That is just super duper well done, and I was very, very pleased with it. I think I see a lot of dichotomies in this novel, and I wrote some of them down. I want to share them with you just as things that when you go into your reading, maybe if you haven't read it yet, or if you're planning on reading it, things that you might look for, these dichotomies in your reading, because I do think that they stood out to me time and time again. First and foremost, dream versus reality. This is perhaps the most significant dichotomy present in the work. There are a couple other major competitors, but this is a huge one. Everything is predicated off of the vegetarian's dream. The dream is what pushes the vegetarian to become the vegetarian. And dream versus reality, what that is, how that looks, is so beautifully done here. It's beautifully rendered, and we are left questioning, how hallucinatory is our reality, is our experience? How much do we know of our experience as to be true and real and in this moment? Fantastic stuff. I love that. The next one, a little more subtle, spring versus winter. There's a lot of language here that's sort of spring, blooming, almost floral in nature. There's also a lot of coldness and temperature. You're going to see a lot of this warmth versus cold, spring versus winter. It's something to think about here. Going along with dream versus reality, the third one I have is normal versus abnormal. There is an obsession with normality throughout The Vegetarian that I think translates incredibly well to U.S. readers. I think folks in the U.S. are hyper fixated at times on being normal. This is something we see time and time again. A condition of the suburbs. I want to appear normal. I want to save face. This is a huge, huge condition in part one. Normal versus abnormal. Huge, huge. In that first part, that first third of the novel, normal versus abnormal is huge. And then finally, the fourth one I have is the violent versus the erotic. And the violent versus the erotic comes to play in part two of The Vegetarian in a major, major way. So I think the subsections here in part one, what might be most apparent is going to be normal versus abnormal. In part two, the violent versus the erotic. And then throughout, I'm going to see dream versus reality, spring versus winter. Now, one of the things that I immediately thought of when I was reading this, with this sort of dream versus reality thing is it really, in the end, really reminded me of The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, Der Zauberberg. And that, that sort of playing with what is real, what is unreal, what is dream, what is not dream, that is something that in The Magic Mountain and Der Zauberberg is a huge through line. And I kept thinking about that time and time again. Another thing that I was thinking of throughout all of this, especially in part two with that violent versus the erotic, that really made me think of Murakami's 1Q84, which is a contemporary, actually was written published just shortly after The Vegetarian. And I do not know, I was not able to sort out in terms of translations if Murakami would have been able to have read The Vegetarian while writing 1Q84. Nor was I able to sort out whether or not Murakami is proficient in Korean and if he reads Korean. But I was really reminded of 1Q84 in those moments in part two. If you know me, I'm not a big proponent of this novel by Murakami. I really hesitate to recommend it. I think to me, if I was choosing between the two, which was better done in terms of that meditation on the long-standing tradition of human violence, which I think both are getting at, and which both sort of have sex deeply entangled in them. The vegetarian wins out time and time again on that. But I see sort of a thematic interconnection between part 2 of The Vegetarian and a lot of what's going on in 1Q84. It's something for folks to sort of consider there. If you really liked 1Q84, you'll probably have a much better time even with The Vegetarian by Kang. Just in terms of that meditation. I think, the Mongolian mark, the second section, one of the reasons why it does sort of remind me of 1Q84 is because a Mongolian mark is this kind of birthmark that fades with age. And it's used in The Vegetarian as the signifier. The vegetarian never loses her Mongolian mark. And this really, it's almost tabooed in how we're thinking about youth, and how we're thinking about innocence. And it because we're so situated in a thematic discussion of violence, that really pushes us to take this discussion of violence into really uncomfortable territory when it comes to determining who is innocent. At what point do we become an adult? At what point do we become mature, or perhaps better said, mature enough to be able to participate in this longer tradition of human violence? And there's a lot to be said there that's really, really complicated. And that, I think, that section also, pushes us to consider art and sexuality and eroticism in really profound ways. And I've seen folks on socials talking about how weird part 2 is, talking about how weird the body painting and the art sort of thematics that go through that section are. And there's a lot to unpack there. And I think, where I would start is that dichotomy that I just pointed to a few minutes ago, which is this, discussion where we're going to try and differentiate the violent versus the erotic. And how are these two connected? And to what extent is it appropriate that they're connected? And then we might even complicate this further by asking ourselves, how is power involved in this? And who gets to have what power? And then we might even complicate it further by asking ourselves, who gets to express ideas about this or have their ideas more widely shared, in the sense of an artist. How widely shared may an artist be? Obviously, Han Kang is translated in all sorts of languages, won the Nobel. So this discussion, this discourse that's happening there, I think is really provocative. And I think Kang did a really fantastic job there. And to me, that's not even my favorite section of the novel. But it leaves us with so many questions that I think are timeless. And it's not necessarily the case that we're trying to find the one universal answer of this. I think to me, that's an intellectual mistake that is very commonly made. Is this rigid thinking of, if I have an answer to this, that answer will exist forever. There is a correct answer here. And I don't know that I agree with that. And I don't know that that's what I'm getting from The Vegetarian, because the answers are contextual and they change with time. So there's so much going on there that I think is really provocative. And I thought it was really interesting. Part three is, to me, where this novel is at its best. I think it's a strong novel tip to tail, but part 3 really, really shines. And I think the reason for that is by the time that you've gotten to part 3, you've gotten used to the subtle ways with which Kang and Kang's translator Smith are playing with language. And I would be very interested to read this in the original Korean, not that I have any proficiency in Korean to do so. But part 3 in particular, I would love to see the original language, because the way that tense is used here we have these sections where we start in the present tense and then slip back into past tense, and that is just subtle and beautifully done, where the paragraph begins with a present tense sentence, and by the time that we get to the end, we're back in the past. And it's this back and forth between past and present that is really, really excellently done here. And I think part 3 for me just really stood out. It's so poetic how the language is used, and the stakes are the highest. Narratively speaking, we are at this point where it's life or death for the vegetarian, and her sister, who narrates this third section, experiencing this, seeing the fallout of everything that's happened, seeing this complete bizarre reaction that's happened to this person being a vegetarian. It is really astounding, and part 3 is, Flaming Tree is really, really beautifully done, really, really excellently done, and I have to take my hat off to Han Kang. I mean, just really, really sharp stuff, and it is a really monumental vision of the human tradition of violence that I think is really important. And I think given the title and given the reaction to vegetarianism, I guess I'll say this. I keep mentioning human violence, and I think some folks may be interested in, is this a greater commentary on vegetarianism? And it really isn't. Vegetarianism is not explored very widely in the novel. It's not necessarily, a huge important thing. It is just, a symbol that is being reacted to. And I think you could swap vegetarianism out for all sorts of things, but this person stopping the act of eating meat, really she becomes vegan. But I don't think if you're a vegetarian out there, if you're a vegan out there, if you're looking for a novel that's a really powerful representation of a vegan or vegetarian lifestyle, this is not the novel for you, because the novel's about violence. And I think, one of the reasons why Kang is choosing vegetarianism, for example, is just a really very simple form of rejecting violence on a simple level by saying, no, I don't want you to kill an animal for me to eat it. I will eat something else instead. That is the act. It's the philosophical act of recognizing that includes violence. And that's why, because actually the vegetarian loves all these different dishes. That's something that is commented on throughout the the work is, oh, you loved, this particular dish. And that, it at the end of the day comes down to philosophy. And I know that there's probably some folks out there watching this, some vegetarians and vegans who are like, oh, well, that's the same philosophy that I have. And yes, that's true. But this is about a larger thing. So don't get your hopes up that this is some, novel about radical vegetarianism that is going to be really, really powerful in your life. But it will be powerful in your life in the sense that it philosophically delves into human violence. That, I think, is really excellently done. And I think one of the reasons why I love part 3 is because it seems like all of these different philosophical quandaries that have been presented to this one family are all of a sudden just so we see this really ultimate, really final, almost reality in which they're living with all of these different philosophical ideas that are happening around them, and how that affects their reality versus their unreality is really quite interesting. I think also in part 3, I mentioned Dead Salvabag, and you know what? Let me pull it off the shelf real quick. I mentioned the Magic Mountain earlier in Dead Salvabag. I think one of the things part 3 really, really reminds me of the Magic Mountain, and I think part of that is because there is another sort of discussion in here, in the Magic Mountain as well as in the Vegetarian, of what constitutes sickness and how willful intent informs being sick. This philosophy of discussing sickness is something that Thomas Mann was really, really interested in. And I have a deep dive about the Magic Mountain down below that you can check out. I think that I don't see that discussion very frequently in the States. Here in the U.S., I don't see necessarily a lot of popular discourse on socials, for example, about what constitutes sickness and wellness on an intentional level, but I see it implicitly in a lot of our discussion of wellness. We have a lot, like in a lot of these bizarre sort of anti-vax discussions out there that are whether they like it or not, deeply ill-informed. They are coming from a place of discussing what constitutes sickness, what constitutes wellness, what agency do we have. And the kind of bizarre anti-intellectual paranoia that anti-vaxxers have, for example, I think that is part of this discourse. And I think in part 3 here, one of the things that surprised me was this discussion over sickness and health and wellness, what all that means, what agency does a person have at the end of the day in their own condition. And I obviously, Kang is doing an incredible intellectual job here. And I think if that's something that you're curious about, what constitutes sickness, what constitutes being healthy, I think part 3 might leave you with some really powerful questions. I do think the Magic Mountain will probably leave you with some questions as well about that. And this is not to say that, that either of these texts are going to be popular with the anti-vax crowd, or that this channel in any way condones any sort of stuff like that, because I do not. But it is to say that we as humans do have to have a discussion of what constitutes being healthy to me, and what constitutes being healthy more widely, and what can we do as individuals in that scenario where we are sick or somebody in our life is sick and we have to navigate that. It's pretty compelling stuff, and I think it's very, very well done here. And to that end, very timely. And overall, I just think that this novel, especially with its language play, especially with how Kang is sort of willing to sort of mess with the sentence a little bit, especially with how profound I think most meditations on violence tend to be, when they're done in a more nuanced way, I think is an important work. I think The Vegetarian, when it comes down to it, this work should absolutely be one of those works where if you like Blood Meridian, you probably should like The Vegetarian, just by proxy of like exploring similar ideas. And that's an interconnection that I don't see a lot of on socials. I don't see a lot of my Blood Meridian friends talking about The Vegetarian, even though I think McCarthy and Kang are probably aiming to do a similar thing here with these novels, which is explore just what it is that is provoking violence in us. Is it some innate quality in humanity that is pushing us along in this violent tradition? And I don't know that I don't know that McCarthy and Blood Meridian, nor do I know if Kang in The Vegetarian reaches a conclusion that provides you a solution. But what they're both doing is asking these questions and providing you with more questions to ask yourself and ask your community and ask your friends and families and whoever, that I think are really compelling and really interesting and really thought-provoking. And I think Kang did a great job. And I think the translation is pretty well done, especially the translation of part 3. The translation of Flaming Trees is particularly well done. Let's talk about some book recs. I talked a little bit about The Magic Mountain. I talked about 1Q84. I guess I will recommend these two novels, again here. I hesitate to recommend 1Q84. It wasn't my favorite work, but maybe you like it, and maybe it might be compelling to you. I think another work that explores a tradition of human violence from a different perspective that is really overlooked, and I will continue to amp up Ozzy Jabbar until people read this, is Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade. One of the just most astounding 20th century novels out there, and I swear, to me, it is as important as Ulysses by James Joyce. And convincing people to read this has been, a huge part of me being on this channel. And it will continue to be until all of you believe me that this is a really excellent book. And it's so beautiful. And you know, when it comes to explorations of the post-colonial condition, post-colonial identity, and the colonial tradition of violence, and how that relates to a larger human tradition of violence, friends, it does not get much more thoughtful, better written than Asa Jabbar in Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade. Another work that I think is really, really excellent, that is a more subtle look at this tradition of violence, is going to be Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. For my friends who like Westerns, for example, I think Willa Cather does some of the best nature writing of the American Southwest in this novel. And to that end, it really does speak to this larger tradition, and situates it in the United States, which might be relevant for some of my viewers. Up next, Gabriel García Márquez. I haven't done a lot. I love García Márquez. I haven't done a lot of recommending of him on the channel. I'm trying to change that. I'll point to an overlooked one for my English readers, which is The Autumn of the Patriarch, which I think also, you know, in its exploration of fascism, is just a really, really excellent and profound sort of meditation on human power. This is my edition's translated from the Spanish by Gregory Rabasa. But you know, The Autumn of the Patriarch is an excellent, and in the United States possibly overlooked, García Márquez work. And finally, you know, I mentioned it, but I'll do it here, and I'll do this with the interest of saying, if you have read this novel, Blood Meridian, by Cormac McCarthy, and this left an impression upon you, then I think The Vegetarian is probably right up your alleyway, because I think that these two are so deeply related and intertwined. I mean, on a philosophical level, I don't know how else to say it. You know, this novel is really sensational. It has really grotesque violence. This novel also is really sensational. It also has really grotesque violence. You know, I think the scale to which McCarthy was willing to go with his violence is really, I think, what has made this novel so widely known once he got famous. And I think, you know, to that end, I can see sort of a similar situation here with what's going on here with Kang. I mentioned Kang exploring, you know, all of this violence in an absurdist lens, as opposed to a magical realist lens. And I think one of the reasons why I stuck to that, and I want to sort of reiterate that here at the end of the video, is because this idea of absurdism, that it doesn't matter and there's no logic, is really it's difficult to reckon with. That's a very difficult sort of philosophical standpoint for people to have, because it's not cathartic. It doesn't afford you the solution that you're looking for. And the absurdism in The Vegetarian, I think we see it with all three of our narrators. Each of these narrators isn't exactly sure what the system is, isn't exactly sure what the solution is. They aren't exactly sure even if what they're exploring is violence or community or social pressure or familial pressure. It just is. It just exists. There might not be an internal logic to it. There might be so much internal logic that it is rendered illogical or something else. And to me, looking at this novel and understanding, you know, the sort of absurdist tendencies that these narrators might be dealing with and how that affects their narration, I think is really excellently done. I was impressed. Kang did a great job here. Overall, you know, I just want to say, you know, we've been skeptical here on the channel, and you should be skeptical at home of, you know, what does an award mean? What does something being canonical mean? Obviously, I don't believe in canonicity. And I think that these are great questions to ask. And when it comes to the Booker or the Nobel, we should ask them. That doesn't necessarily mean that that the work is bad. And you know, Kang is an excellent writer and comes from small presses and has that more small press history that a lot of really popular, really well-connected, wealthy authors don't have. So definitely something to consider here in the sense that Kang is doing a really fantastic job. And also, just any really philosophical, consideration of humanity that is well written. I think that's something that the more of works like that there are in the world, the better. I want to read those works from every culture, every language I can get my hands on too, so that I know more about us, more about people, more about humanity. I think that's really, really important to me. So hats off to Han Kang and Deborah Smith here. Really, really excellently done. I want to thank you folks for spending some time with me today. It means a lot that you have been here. At the top of the video, I said, if you want to support me, please read Always the Wanderer. I'll reiterate that here. Please buy Always the Wanderer. And if you have, friends, family who love experimental literature, go ahead and give them a copy of that. Thank you for that. And I hope your reading practice is going well. I hope you're safe. I hope everything is good. If you want to find out more about me, you can head to georgekors.com. That's my website. You can follow me on socials. I may or may not use at GBK7288. I do not use TikTok anymore. Those videos are still up, but I don't use it. I hope all is well and good, and that you have a fantastic day. Thank you so much. Keep reading. Have a great day. Adios.